hidden effects, yet witnesses insist there was no smoke, no heat beneath him. More similar shapes appeared, forming what looked like an entire army captured on a street camera. Suddenly, he vanished into thin air, leaving only up and down on its own.
Appearing in the Arizona desert in the early decades of the 20th century. You're created when people...
Jerusalem has always carried weight, but what's happening now feels unusually precise. A small crack begins to stretch across the Mount of Olives. A quiet disappearance caught on camera. Shapes in the sky that don't move like clouds should. Stones that resonate when no one touches them. Beneath it all, ancient structures and rituals re-emerging at the same time. The ground itself begins to shift. None of this arrives with explosions or headlines. It unfolds slowly, deliberately, almost patiently. This video doesn't claim answers. It follows patterns forming in a city scripture, places at the center of turning points. If you sense something aligning, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. At first, nothing about the Mount of Olives demanded alarm. The path had carried pilgrims for generations, its stones worn smooth by footsteps, rain, and time. When a thin crack appeared between the slabs, it blended easily into that history. Erosion had done this before. Weather had done worse. No barriers were raised, no warnings issued, and no one imagined the ground itself had begun to speak. Days passed, and the crack refused to remain what it was. It widened slowly, almost patiently, as if the earth were stretching rather than breaking. What unsettled observers was not the size of the opening, but its discipline. The fracture did not wander. It did not branch at random. It pressed forward along a single east-west line, cutting through stonework laid centuries apart, ignoring human boundaries and modern expectations. As the fissure crept downslope, ancient tombs began to feel the strain. Burial stones shifted by millimeters, then more. Paving blocks that had survived empires separated cleanly, as though guided by an invisible ruler beneath the surface. This was not the violence of an earthquake. It was quieter than that. Slower, controlled. The kind of movement that unsettles precisely because it refuses to announce itself. Instruments were deployed, and the results only deepened the unease. Sensors detected microtremors so faint they barely qualified as seismic activity. There were no aftershocks, no surges, no signatures matching known fault systems beneath Jerusalem. The data existed, undeniable and sterile, yet it refused to fit any familiar geological model. The ground was moving, but it was not behaving like ground is supposed to behave. What disturbed experts most was repetition. The motion did not peak and vanish. It returned, again and again. Subtle shifts, spaced over time, suggesting not an accident, but a process. Something beneath the Mount of Olives was adjusting itself, not explosively, but persistently, as if responding to pressure applied long before the first crack appeared. It was only after the direction became undeniable that ancient words resurfaced. Zechariah 14:4 describes the Mount of Olives splitting from east to west, written long before tectonic maps or seismic sensors existed. The text does not shout. It does not speculate. It simply describes a direction. The same direction now etched into stone by a movement no one can fully explain. No one claims the mountain has split. No sirens signal catastrophe. Life continues above the fracture. Yet the unease lingers, because Scripture often describes warning not as collapse, but as motion. Foundations shift before structures fall. The ground adjusts before history turns. What has begun here does not resemble destruction. It resembles preparation. The Mount of Olives has witnessed grief, betrayal, ascension, and prophecy. It has never been a neutral place. When it moves without violence and without noise, the question is no longer whether something dramatic has happened, but whether something irreversible has started. If this caught your attention, tap like and keep watching. It lasted only seconds, yet it refused to fade. The security camera showed an ordinary Jerusalem street, unchanged, unremarkable, alive with routine. A man walked through the frame at a steady pace, posture relaxed, no sign of distress. He was not running, not distracted, not reacting to anything unseen. Everything about the moment suggested normality, the kind people trust without thinking. Then, the normality broke. The man did not stumble or turn. He did not step behind a vehicle or pass into shadow. One frame showed him mid-stride. The next showed absence. Not blur, not distortion. Absence. Where his body had been, a faint mist-like residue hung briefly in the air, thin and undefined, before dissolving completely. The street remained. The camera continued recording. The man did not. Investigators searched for the obvious explanations and found none waiting for them. There was no collision frame, no dropped object, no visual obstruction, no blind angle that could swallow a human body whole. Frame-by-frame analysis showed continuity everywhere, except where the man should have been. The footage did not glitch. The timestamp did not skip. Reality, at least as captured by the camera, appeared to pause and then resume without him. What unsettled viewers most was the silence. There was no flash, no shockwave, no disturbance to the environment. Dust on the ground did not scatter. Nearby objects did not react. Life continued its rhythm as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, which only sharpened the horror of what had. Disappearance without violence feels more unnatural than destruction, because it leaves nothing to confront, nothing to explain away. Authorities offered no public explanation, no reconstruction, no confirmation of error. The footage circulated quietly at first, passed between analysts, then leaked into wider discussion. Each viewing raised the same question that refused to settle. How does a person vanish in open space without resistance, interruption, or trace? Only after the shock lingered did an ancient passage resurface. Luke 17:34-36 speaks of people taken from ordinary moments, one present and the other gone. Not during chaos, but during routine. The words were written to describe sudden separation in the middle of life. Not spectacle, not warning sirens, not collapse. Reading it now feels less metaphorical than it once did. No claim is made that this is fulfillment. No declaration follows the footage. What remains is the unease of alignment, the way disappearance occurred not in war or disaster, but in calm, familiar movement. Scripture often places its most severe warnings inside normal days, precisely because that is when vigilance fades. The man did not leave a scream or a struggle. He left a gap. And gaps, especially silent ones, are where fear settles longest. Comment what you think happened here, before we move on. It began as an ordinary sky, pale and unremarkable, hanging over Jerusalem like it had thousands of times before. Clouds drifted without urgency, light catching their edges, nothing that demanded a second look. Then shapes began to emerge, not suddenly, but gradually, as if the sky itself were organizing. The formations did not behave like clouds are expected to behave. They did not stretch, dissolve, or scatter with the wind. Instead, they held their contours, shifting together with a strange consistency. Observers noticed alignment first, then symmetry. The shapes moved as if aware of one another, maintaining distance, adjusting position, never colliding, never breaking formation. What unsettled viewers was not what the shapes resembled, but how they moved. natural cloud patterns are chaotic, governed by pressure and air currents. These forms appeared deliberate, advancing across the sky, with a rhythm that felt measured rather than accidental. The longer the footage played, the harder it became to dismiss the impression of coordination. Debate erupted almost immediately. Some analysts insisted the footage must be manipulated, pointing to advances in AI-generated imagery and deepfake technology. Others argued for rare atmospheric phenomena, unusual interactions of light, moisture, and wind, producing illusions the human brain instinctively organizes into figures. Yet neither explanation fully satisfied, because neither could explain why the movement remained synchronized across frames without distortion or breakup. No independent technical verification confirmed either claim. The video remained suspended in uncertainty, circulating without resolution, analyzed but not closed. The lack of a definitive answer only amplified its impact. When technology fails to debunk and science hesitates to classify, imagination fills the vacuum, and imagination is rarely gentle. Only after the argument exhausted itself did an ancient image surface. Revelation 19:14 describes armies in heaven, moving together, clothed in white, following a single command. The passage was not cited as proof or fulfillment, only as resemblance. The description had existed for centuries, long before satellites, lenses, or digital manipulation made such images conceivable. The parallel unsettled because it did not rely on interpretation alone. It relied on posture, alignment, and motion. Scripture often communicates power through order rather than chaos, through ranks rather than storms. Seeing something in the sky that behaves less like weather and more like formation forces an uncomfortable pause, even for those who reject symbolic readings. Nothing descended from the clouds. No sound followed. The sky returned to its usual silence, leaving behind footage that refuses to settle. Whether illusion, manipulation, or phenomenon, the question remains why it appeared where it did, and why it moved the way it did. Jerusalem has always been described as a place where heaven and earth seem uncomfortably close. AI or something else? Let us know below, and stay with us. It started beneath the surface, far from cameras and crowds, in a place no one was meant to see. The Mount of Olives has been scanned, studied, and walked for centuries, its slopes mapped so thoroughly that most believed nothing new could still be hiding there. That assumption did not survive the data. Ground-penetrating radar, enhanced by AI analysis, began returning shapes that refused to be dismissed as noise. The images did not blur or fragment the way natural voids usually do. They sharpened, lines straightened, angles repeated. What emerged was a chamber, rectangular and symmetrical, carved with intention rather than chance. The structure did not resemble a cave, a collapse, or erosion. It did not match burial chambers, water cisterns, or tunnels documented by archaeologists. Its geometry was too precise, its proportions too deliberate. This was not something the earth formed on its own. It was something placed, then concealed. What deepened the unease was its orientation. The chamber aligned with exact precision toward the Golden Gate, the sealed eastern gate of Jerusalem. Not approximately, not symbolically, precisely. That alignment raised immediate questions, because orientation like this is rare even in monumental construction, let alone in a structure buried and forgotten. Historical records offered no relief. No text described a chamber at this location. No excavation logs hinted at prior disturbance. No tradition preserved its memory. It existed outside the known narrative, as if removed from history on purpose, rather than lost to time. Then came the markings. Along one interior surface, Radar scans detected inscriptions etched into stone. Not scratches, not fractures, characters. Ancient Hebrew forms, unmistakable in structure, yet impossible to read without direct access. No translation has been released, no dating confirmed. The message remains sealed, not by stone alone, but by silence. Only after the discovery circulated quietly did an old passage resurface. Ezekiel 44:1 speaks of the eastern gate being shut, sealed, and reserved, not for common passage, but for a future purpose. The text does not explain when or how that moment arrives. It only insists that the gate remains closed until it does. The connection unsettles because the chamber does not appear abandoned, it appears withheld. Its placement feels less like neglect and more like restraint, as if it was never meant to be accessed until something else changed above it. The mountain has not opened. The gate has not moved. Yet something beneath them is no longer fully hidden. Nothing has been removed. Nothing has been revealed completely. The chamber waits, aligned, marked, undocumented, and untouched. In a city where history is loud and relentless, this silence feels intentional. If you're following the pattern, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. It did not begin with noise. It began with silence, the kind that settles over ancient places when foot traffic thins and the city exhales. Then, without warning, the stones answered. Witnesses first described it as a metallic resonance, sharp but contained, rising briefly before cutting off. Not an echo, not a rumble, a tone. In some cases, the sound carried the hollow clarity of a trumpet, compressed and distant, as if forced through stone rather than air. It lasted seconds, never long enough to locate, never short enough to dismiss. What unsettled observers most was the absence of cause. No one touched the stones. No machinery operated nearby. No construction crews. No passing vehicles. No shifting crowds. The sound did not travel outward like normal vibration. It seemed to belong to the stone itself, as though the material were momentarily active. Engineers placed sensors close to the affected areas. The instruments registered localized movement, minute but undeniable. The readings confirmed motion without revealing a source. There was no pattern consistent with mechanical interference, no signature matching wind, traffic, or underground infrastructure. The data existed, clean and stubborn, offering confirmation without explanation. Jerusalem's stones are not ordinary building materials. Many have stood through invasions, earthquakes, fires, and centuries of pressure layered on pressure. They have absorbed weight, prayer, blood, and time. These stones have always been treated as witnesses, silent carriers of memory, rather than participants in events. That assumption no longer feels secure. The sounds did not repeat on command. They appeared sporadically, unpredictably, as if responding rather than initiating. Observers noted that the tones often emerged during moments of unusual stillness, when voices dropped and movement slowed. The timing felt intrusive, almost corrective, like an interruption rather than an accident. Only later did an old line surface, spoken long before microphones or sensors existed. Luke 19:40 records the words, "If they keep silent, the stones will cry out." The verse was not offered as interpretation, only as parallel. It described a moment when human voices failed and something older took their place. That comparison unsettles because it reframes the phenomenon. The question shifts from how the sound was produced to why it appeared at all. Stones do not announce themselves without reason. In Scripture, trumpets signal transitions, warnings, and arrivals. They mark moments when delay ends and attention becomes mandatory. Nothing cracked, nothing collapsed. The stones returned to stillness as abruptly as they spoke, yet the impression lingered, heavier than the sound itself. Jerusalem has always been a city that speaks through history. Now, its stones seem less willing to wait. If this made you pause, hit like, and keep listening. It happened where fire should never behave that way. Inside a quiet worship space, where wood, metal, and fabric normally surrender instantly to heat, flames appeared and refused to obey every rule people trust to keep them safe. Witnesses described the fire forming around the cross, not erupting, not spreading, but enclosing it. The flames rose and curled with intensity, yet there was no smoke, no choking scent, no crackle of destruction. What should have scorched surfaces and blackened edges left nothing behind. The moment felt wrong in a way that instinct recognizes before logic can speak. Fire consumes. It marks. It destroys evidence of what it touches. This fire did none of that, burning visibly while leaving the cross unchanged, untouched, and intact. Those present expected alarms, damage, panic, or at least lingering heat. Instead, the fire faded as suddenly as it appeared, withdrawing without residue or explanation. When the space was examined afterward, there were no scorch marks, no melted materials, no measurable temperature anomalies left behind. Officials offered no scientific conclusion. Electrical faults were considered and quietly dismissed. Chemical reactions were suggested, yet no accelerants, wiring issues, or ignition sources were identified. The event remained recorded, witnessed, and unresolved. What unsettled observers most was the restraint. The flames had power but showed control. They surrounded rather than attacked, illuminated rather than devoured. In a world conditioned to expect destruction first, restraint feels unnatural, even threatening. Only after the shock settled did an ancient image surface. Exodus 3:2 describes a bush that burned with fire, yet was not consumed, a moment where flames signaled presence rather than judgment. The comparison was not offered as proof, only as resemblance that refuses to fade. In Scripture, fire often marks transitions. It purifies, calls, warns, and reveals. When fire appears without consuming, it signals intention rather than chaos. It demands attention without forcing escape. The location matters. Jerusalem is not a neutral stage for symbolism. It is layered with memory, sacrifice, and expectation. Events that might be dismissed elsewhere feel heavier here, as if the city amplifies meaning whether one believes or not. No voice accompanied the flames. No message followed. The silence afterward carried its own pressure, heavier than noise would have been. Those who witnessed it described unease rather than comfort. Not fear of harm, but fear of implication. Fire without damage confronts assumptions. It suggests that power does not always announce itself through destruction. Sometimes it reveals itself through control, through the deliberate decision not to consume. The cross remained standing, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Yet for those who saw it, everything felt altered. When something burns and refuses to destroy, it leaves questions that linger far longer than ash ever could. Share your thoughts in the comments before the next sign. It did not break, it rose. Residents first noticed it while walking familiar streets, places crossed daily without thought. Asphalt that had always lain flat now curved subtly upward, forming shallow ridges that felt wrong underfoot. There was no crash, no sudden collapse, no chaos. The ground was not failing. It was pushing back. What makes this unsettling is how it moved. Roads did not crack open into sinkholes. Pavement did not cave inward or crumble at the edges.